Warm greetings from the Organization of Southern Cooperation's headquarters. The last time we had one of those sessions, which I believe was episode 10, we were in the midst of the preparations of our second ordinary session of the General Assembly. And we spoke in a very short episode, that was, within the General Assembly Hall. And now we are back. General Assembly concluded, here for this 11th episode of the Third Way, live with the SG, at the headquarters. But for some of you that have been following us for quite some time, you will notice that this is a slightly different setting than the one you're usually seeing when it comes to the OSC headquarters. And that is because I have a confession to make. And the confession that I have to make is I have two offices. I have the big office where the major events happen, or when I have a lot of people to meet with at the same time from the Secretariat. And then I have this office. It is far less fancy. It is far less spacious. In fact, for those that cannot see, unfortunately, that behind the cameras, I have a number of the team members here stacked as if they were sardines within a can. That being, and a tin. That being said, this is the office that I use to work. That is the office that I use when there is a lot of paperwork. They cleaned up the desk to make sure this was not too chaotic. This is the desk I used to oversee the preparations for the common program proposal that we submitted to the General Assembly. In short, this is the office where I roll up my sleeves. And I decided to hold this session in this office, this work office, because as, and of course we will talk about this in a moment, but as the General Assembly has concluded, as the Organization of Southern Cooperation enters into a new phase of its existence in support of member states, in support of associate members, in support of our peoples in this collective construction for a third way of development, which is the only purpose for which we have those sessions, that is to engage more proactively, directly, in a genuine dialogue and exchange with every single one of you so that you may become the protagonists and spearhead this endeavor. Well, as this General Assembly concluded and ushered in a new era of the OSC, well, ours is not now the responsibility of lying on our backs with our feet on the table and tapping each other on the back and saying, well done, we've done it. Now, don't misunderstand me, of course. We had that small moment. But now the General Assembly concluded 2 or 3 days ago. So now is the moment, we at the Secretariat, but also the member states, and the associate members, and we hope, we are convinced, every single one of you, now is the moment to roll up our sleeves. And this is why we are doing this session from here. But before engaging in more of my introduction to explain to you what was the essence of the deliberations at the General Assembly, the main outcomes, let's do a gentle reminder to all of the participants, as always, with particular emphasis on the ones early morning, their time in Latin America and the Caribbean, joining us. Those particularly up late in Far East Asia, in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific, that are there to join us. And that gentle reminder, of course, is that these spaces of the OSC are not spaces provided for me to pontificate time and time again. This is a space that, yes, of course, I do share some general thoughts, some updates, because the OSC is also determined to be an open organization. But this is a space for your voice to be heard. This is a space for you in the comment section on social media, but also through WhatsApp, to send your comments, to articulate your proposals, to share your views, even, I dare say, to articulate your criticism or critique of what we have been doing or what we plan to do. And I, as always, within the limits of time, will seek to address absolutely every single one of them, and to do so without filters. That being said, as I was saying, the General Assembly, the second ordinary session of the General Assembly, convened here in Addis Ababa from the 25th to the 28th of November, and was really structured around four principal segments. We had the segment that was, excluding of course the very protocol-centered inauguration of the Assembly, we had the strategic direction segment, where we debated and discussed issues of strategic importance and orientation for the organization. Then, of course, we had the segment of education, research, and culture, where we delved into the heart of the program that we were proposing to the member states. We then had, of course, the technological innovation and digitalization segment. And finally, we had the financing for development segment. And of course, over this assembly, that was comprehensive, because again, our General Assembly, as some of you may know already, meets once every 2 years. There are, of course, possibilities of extraordinary meetings, convening, but usually these tend to be on more specific issues. And therefore, this General Assembly is an assembly, the ordinary sessions, that is, are the moment in which, as a collective of member states, as a collective of associate members, as a collective of individuals committed to this vision from the Greater South and by the Greater South, yet profoundly humanistic, that is, for humanity, enter into a communion where we refound ourselves. We re-establish ourselves. That is, we look back, and that is what we did. Over the past 2 years, at everything that we have achieved. That is, building a secretariat from scratch that is now extremely capable, that is now entirely capable, and has demonstrated it by delivering the common program. Of course, looking back at the implementation of the common program of the last 2 years, at the success in launching the Greater South Information System, that now counts, in the span of a few months, more than 400,000 resources, academic publications, that democratizes access to knowledge for the institutions of our countries, but also makes research of our countries more visible. We could look back and see the success that was the launch as part of our Freire program, our student and academic mobility scheme. The scholarship program within it that granted up to 400 scholarships annually and has already granted 300 scholarships to the citizens of over 17 of our countries. We looked also, even though it is due to be held shortly, not yet held, but we looked at the provisional numbers of attendance of the Greater South Fair for Endogenous Technology to provide a space to our young innovators, to our startups, that they may be more visible, that they may exchange, collaborate, build strategic partnerships, learn from each other, ensure that we become drivers of the technological revolution. And of course, looking at those numbers and seeing that we are already at, I believe, over 40 startups that will be provided booths within the Greater South Fair for Endogenous Technology, and over 39 participants to a hackathon that occurred, and of course that is excluding the number of panelists that will be there to lead fascinating conversations. And this, of course, extraordinary for a first edition. We looked back at the success that was as well the historic launch, the historic decision to adopt the bylaws that established the Common Leveraging Union of Borrowers, the club, as the world's first, and so far only, genuine club or union of sovereign debtors, sovereign borrowers, that we may finally have an instrument of borrower coordination to achieve our aspirations, always, of course, by decision of the member states through consensus, but always achieving that dimension of coordinating our efforts with an executive secretariat to achieve debt relief, to achieve fresh finance that is more concessional, less conditional, more transformative. And of course, the OSCE Institute that is spearheading the efforts of building national capacity so the member states are leading the effort of transformation for which the OSCE was created, and launched only in January this year, and yet that has already built the capacities of 15 going on to 16 now, officials of member states. Now, we looked back, we celebrated successes, but we also recognized some of the challenges that we met. No path worth treading is already paved. And there are always moments where one slips slightly. There are always moments when one stumbles over. But of course, the most important is not to give up. It is to continue walking forward. And in this regard, we also looked at those shortcomings. And therefore, looking forward at this General Assembly, the most crucial aspect was building upon our successes, expanding the Greater South information system, upscaling the Greater South Fair for Endogenous Technologies, consolidating and expanding the OSCE Institute, further reinforcing our Common Leveraging Union of Borrowers, and so on and so forth. And how, also, can we learn from our shortcomings, address them, and enhance our collective? And so, over the 4 days, the intense 4 days of that assembly, we deliberated, we discussed, we communicated, and the General Assembly adopted, I am taking the pause for dramatic effect, adopted at the hemisphere the Common Programme and Budget for 2025-2026 that contains many projects, but that is structured around 7 stanzas, as I've said in the past. But now let me reaffirm them in the knowledge that it is no longer a proposal. It is a roadmap. 7 stanzas or 7 areas of action. Building knowledge-powered societies by addressing the inequities of knowledge within our countries and enhancing collaboration and cooperation amongst our universities, intellectuals, researchers. Becoming drivers of the technological revolution, which implies overcoming the techno-digital divide not only through donations or through purchases of often costly technologies that are also closed source and patented, but to bridge the divide between technology producing and technology consuming countries. of accelerating the balanced and inclusive transformation of education. That our education systems, which are central, which are the foundation of our endeavors, that give sustainability to the vision because it ensures the paradigmatic shift that we need, and that our youth are provided with the opportunities and the skills to be the leaders, not tomorrow, today, of this transformation. Because always remember that our youth, it is alive, that the youth are our future. No, no, no. It is not entirely true. Youth are half of the present and the entirety of the future. And therefore accelerating this transformation of our education systems on the basis of the Universal Declaration of Balanced and Inclusive Education. But also revitalizing cultural and artistic yields, enshrining the human dimension within development, recognizing also that without culture, without the arts that have been too often forgotten from the development discourse, or have been limited to conversations within our countries of preservation and conservation of heritage, which is important but is insufficient, without culture and the arts that recognize that there is no culture without a people, and that people ultimately are not stuck in the past. They are rooted in their past. They are informed by their history. They are informed and influenced by those that have preceded them and continue their legacy. But they also live in the contemporary world and absorb influences from across sectors. They change, they walk, they evolve, and so do our cultures. And therefore, without culture in the arts, revitalized cultural and artistic yields, there is no language, common language that transcends linguistic barriers. And therefore, there can be no mobilization. And if there is no mobilization, there can be no transformation. And therefore, revitalizing cultural and artistic yields, in particular, by nurturing, fostering, stimulating our creative industries, but also, crucially, by bridging cultural divides across continents, across countries, within countries, and I dare say, between also communities. But revitalizing cultural and artistic yields, that as one of the crucial stanzas of our endeavors. The other, of course, the crucial one, is also, because it would be disingenuous to speak of a common program, a transformative common program of the member states and associates and of our countries, without addressing one crucial aspect, which is the economic dimension of development. And therefore, adopting that action area which is creating shared green prosperity, prosperity that is more equitable, but also more sustainable. And therefore working towards transforming the international financial architecture, but also towards having a common strategy of strategic investments within our country, strategic endeavors to ensure that in the medium term we can overcome the structural drivers that generate the dependencies within our economies, while simultaneously aiming and not only integrating the fight against climate change. And I say not only because the truth is, And I think that these spaces ought to be transparent, they ought to be honest, they need to be here without just a sequence of slogans. Because you'll hear nowadays everybody's fighting against climate change. The question is, how do we go about it concretely? And therefore, not only fighting against climate change, which is important, but most crucially, leveraging ecological policy and strategies and projects as a source of development, as a source as well of job creation. And therefore, ecologically driven development is a crucial part of the program that the member states approved. But also, intensifying another action area, another stanza, intensifying South-South cooperation and integration. Ensuring that South-South cooperation does not remain abstract, but tangible, contributing decisively to the realization of the aspirations of our countries and peoples. And of course, in this regard, also embodying in that South-South cooperation the new multilateralism that we have been defending to this day and that we have sought to embody to this day, a multilateralism of equality amongst parties, of equity in their relations, and of solidarity rather than charity. But also a South-South cooperation and integration that recognizes the need to enshrine what I call the 3Ds within our endeavors. A cooperation that remains democratic, one country, one vote. Diverse, recognizing that we share many characteristics, but also that we are very different in terms of our historical trajectories or the ideologies that we may have. But that is our strength when these differences meet in a respectful encounter that creates a mosaic that spans the globe. And of course, that cooperation remains development-centered, does not enter into the abstract, nor into petty quarrels that are not fruitful to the realization of our aspirations. But of course, integration. Because hearing me, you might say, but where's the integration part? And the integration part is recognizing that for South-South cooperation to be effective, to be sustainable, to be fruitful in the long term, it must be accompanied in parallel in a dynamic of integration on 3 levels. Intra-regional, inside every region. Again, a more integrated Latin America and the Caribbean is a stronger South-South, more effective South-South cooperation. A more integrated Africa is a stronger South-South cooperation. A more integrated Arab world is better South-South cooperation. A more integrated Southeast Asia is a better South-South cooperation, and so on and so forth. Inter-regional integration. Building the bridges that between our countries, bridges both conceptually, figuratively, but also almost literally. That is, on the one hand, the projects, the endeavors that ensure that our countries exchange best practices, learn from each other, work together, agree to common projects that are mutually beneficial, but also investing in the infrastructure that enables that cooperation to happen, that enables more trade between our continents, our regions, that enables more traveling between our countries, our regions. And finally, integration, people to people. Integration between our peoples, beyond what our governments agree on, which is indispensable. no South-South cooperation without the political will and commitment of our governments, but in parallel the integration, the bridges between our peoples that ensure that beyond changes that may occur 20 years from now in geopolitics, our peoples are still working together. And finally, the last stanza. Just as I was speaking of infrastructure, this vision also requires its own infrastructure. And this is what makes the OSC, in many respects, an essential entity for our countries, because the only intergovernmental organization of the South with an executive secretariat capable of implementing the decisions of the member states, and therefore the last stanza, solidifying the organization the South deserves. On multiple fronts, by the creation of a council of the wise, leveraging the experience, the views, the insights of individuals from across our greater South that have gained through their life experiences and achievements well recognized and deserved respect, and that have contributed in their own capacities, in their own places, to our collective vision to strengthen our strategic decision making, but also bringing our secretariat closer to the member states by starting to open regional offices in the regions especially that are currently underrepresented within our state membership. And I say opening regional offices, I do not mean it on a political representation or diplomatic representation, but mostly on a technical level, to better accompany the member states in achieving their aspirations, which are our shared aspirations. And of course, also opening up a new phase of collaborative work with non-member states, but also crucially, with other multilateral organizations, to confederate efforts, to avoid duplication of efforts, but also to carry the collective voice of our members. And this is what was adopted at this General Assembly. But of course, many other things occurred. One of the issues is with the adoption of this common program. I have, as you all probably know, I was elected in January 2020 for a 6-year non-renewable term starting at the first General Assembly. But as Secretary General-elect, I was also chair of the preparatory committee to prepare the launch of our organizations, and I served in that former capacity, that is, chair of the preparatory committee, for 2 years almost. And I took office, and this will be in a few days, on the 6th of December. And therefore I have reached my hemistick, that is the half point of my verse as Secretary General. 3 years of service behind me, 3 years ahead. But with the entry into this new phase, I also thought and believed that my duty as Secretary General was to ensure that at any given point, beyond what the Charter says, that the voice of the member states and their associates would always be heard. And therefore I offered to the General Assembly, in order for them to determine to step down as Secretary General, should they consider it necessary to have new, fresh leadership for this new phase of this organization. The General Assembly requested me, I would say insisted, that I continue serving in this new phase of our organization for the remainder of my term, that is for the next 3 years. And as they requested this, I am first of all grateful for the recognition that the members have demonstrated of the endeavors that have been mine in ensuring that our organization would pass from a piece of paper to an actual positive force for change. And I am, of course, obligated now to redouble efforts to deserve that continued trust and support. And that is what we will do. And this is why the last item I want to mention from this General Assembly is, of course, that we also deliberated extensively on the constitutive bylaws of the Greater South Development Bank, receiving the feedback that was necessary in order for us to convene in the first half of next year a final meeting for our member states to finally launch the financial institution of the Greater South that will enable our countries to continue with greater impetus on that path that we have all collectively been making through walking. And all of this, of course, culminating as well with the election of the new President of the General Assembly in Cambodia, generating, of course, a geographic rotation and with extraordinary support from the African group, the African electoral group of our member states, who demonstrated their commitment to South-South cooperation by insisting that it was the turn for Asia-Pacific, the Asia-Pacific electoral group, to lead that General Assembly, that supreme governing body of our organization. And of course, there was a moment of brief celebration. And as I said, here we are, rolling up our sleeves, and tomorrow, far from taking holidays, we are attending the launch of the first edition of the Greater South Fair for Endogenous Technologies. And for those of you who are here in Addis Ababa, I highly invite you to attend. It will happen in collaboration with the Ministry of Innovation and Technology here in Addis Ababa at the Science Museum. And as I said, startups from 14 countries for this first edition will be joining us. The participants to the hackathon will be joining us. Panelists from across our Greater South will be participating, so that we not only become drivers of technology, but so that we collectively, as countries, as peoples, no longer remain passengers of the future. Because our determination stems from the recognition that there is a single choice to make. We either come together and proactively forge the future, or we decide to passively be forged by it. Our choice has been made. We will sculpt the future to which we aspire as countries and peoples of the Greater South, but also the future that humanity in its entirety deserves. I have spoken longer than I had intended, but I now open the floor for all your questions, comments, critiques, proposals, and we shall engage in this exchange as we always have, without filters. And I look at the comments and questions So I see a question on LinkedIn from Kintu Daniel, who asks, is this really live? I certainly hope it is, because otherwise I'll have been speaking for nothing. So it is live, and I hope that I am too alive. We have a question from Emmeline, who says, greetings from Cambodia. How specifically does the OSC provide benefit to us, the people, beyond governments? Then a follow-up that says, sir, my apologies, you already answered my question, but if you can give some specific examples, it will be appreciated. Well, there is always, Emily, and greetings to Cambodia through you. There is always a tension, and that is true. When you are a multilateral, intergovernmental organization, there is always that tension, which your role is to work with the governments. But to support the governments, of course, to deliver better on the aspirations of their peoples as established within our charter and as per national priorities. And of course, the wish, the desire, the determination to fulfill and involve our peoples. And that tension is constant, because it is true that the risk as a multilateral organization is, because of the nature of their organization, that is being multilateral, you appear too distant from the peoples. And of course, far from us, because that will never be the OSC approach, far from us to interfere as well in national affairs, internal affairs of each country. Ours is to work with the governments to achieve those aspirations. That being said, many of the projects that we have, which are approved by our governments and are the result of collaboration with the governments of the member states, directly benefit the peoples of our member states. A concrete example is the framework to reinforce exchanges between youth and regions through education, FREIRE, a student and academic mobility scheme. Through that scheme, we have already launched an annual scholarship program to provide up to 400 postgraduate scholarships to the citizens of the member states, and which we plan, as approved by the General Assembly, to pass on to 800 scholarships within the upcoming biennium. Which means that by the end of the next 2 years, hopefully, the OSC will have been in a position to provide 1,200 scholarships to the citizens of our member states. But then you look at other factors. The Greater South Information, and of course, once FREIRE is fully launched, which the member states have agreed to and provided us the budget to achieve, it will also open up beyond scholarships the opportunity of student exchanges and also scholar and academic staff exchanges across our countries. Then you have the Greater South Information System, GRESIS, which is this digital platform that responds to 3 imperatives. The first is the unequal, inequitable access to cutting-edge knowledge and research in our countries. Second, the lack of visibility of the extraordinary research within our countries that exists. And third, the limited collaboration and cooperation between our researchers and scholars. And between our researchers and scholars and holders, custodians of endogenous knowledge. And therefore, GRESIS is a platform we designed in-house that is a digital platform, open source, that provides to the universities, the student bodies, the government bodies as well, of course, the public bodies, of the research centers of our member states, free of charge access to an ever-growing database and repository of academic resources and as well as endogenous knowledge repositories. And we launched this in February this year, and yet, here we are. Already, in this very short amount of time, more than 400,000 resources on the platform that enables our universities, our centers, etc., to have greater access to knowledge. Knowledge that can then be transformed into innovation, that can then be transformed into application that serves our communities. But crucially as well, that makes research from our countries more visible, and by integrating artificial intelligence to provide instantaneous translations of an accuracy of 90 to 95%, overcome the initial linguistic barrier to make sure that someone from, say, the Arab world, reading in Arabic, can read an article that was written in Latin America in Spanish, and therefore facilitate collaboration. Now, in this regard, and in this endeavor, ours is also the determination to also enhance the activities that are ours so that they reach more of our member states and therefore more of our peoples. So for instance, the Greater South Fair for Endogenous Technology, which I have mentioned, where it is our young people, our startups, that are truly coming together to be evidenced. And of course, this year, as I said, we have approximately over 40 startups. But we want that the second edition, and that is what has been approved by the General Assembly, reaches even more startups from even more of our countries. But of course, I would be remiss in my duty, Emlyn, if I did not also emphasize that when we receive at the OSCE institutes officials from the Ministry of Education to reinforce their national capacities, for them to return to their home ministry, and then for them to lead the capacity building of their colleagues within the ministry, in order to achieve the educational transformation to which we aspire. Yes, that is not directly a benefit to the peoples, but that ultimately means that you will have a Ministry of Education with even better capacities to respond to the aspirations of their youth in their societies by transforming the education system capably, effectively, to achieve the universal access to quality and equitable education. And of course, there's many other endeavors and projects. Look, for instance, the Common Leveraging Union of Borrowers, the club that I've mentioned. Needless to say, the club is a prerogative of governments, because we are talking about sovereign debt. We are talking about fresh finance for development. But ultimately, why do we want to talk about it? That is the more important question. It's because when you speak of debt, it's very easy to forget the human dimension of it. We live in a world where 3.3 billion people, as I've said repeatedly in the past, but I will repeat it and ratify it time and time again until it is no longer a reality. 3.3 billion people live in countries where the governments have no other choice. That is, it's not national policy. They have no other choice than to spend more on debt service than they can on health or education. And so, through the club, by achieving a more equitable international financial architecture, ensuring greater fiscal space for our governments, we are also collectively, not just the Secretariat, this is a collective endeavor of the countries, the associates, and the Secretariat, as well as every single one of you. We are achieving the ability, even though it doesn't sound particularly attractive when you speak of fiscal space, the ability of our governments to spend more where it matters, on education, on health, on agriculture that feeds our peoples. So I could go on many of the new projects as well that we're proposing, but I think these are the examples in terms of that I will immediately mention, in terms of better answering and servicing the aspirations of our peoples. Now, needless to say, I remain available during this session to further elaborate or clarify any aspect that you may consider necessary. I look at other questions. So I saw there was a comment about audio being a bit low. So I leave it to our most capable technical team. My apologies about this, Sayed Takil. I see a question from José Luis Salmón Soriano. In Spanish, I'll address it very quickly in Spanish so as not to take too much time regarding a specific segment. But in this he says, felicitaciones a todo el equipo de la OCS por el exitoso desarrollo de la OCSGA. Okay, OSCGA. Sin dudas fue un buen espacio para construir el futuro y el multilateralismo que la humanidad necesita. A raíz del nuevo bienio de trabajo aprobado, la Secretaría ha recibido documentos de adhesión para incorporar a nuevos Estados miembros dentro de la organización. Bueno, la respuesta, estimado José Luis, es que en realidad no. ¿En qué sentido? En el sentido de que no fue sometido a consideración de los Estados en la Asamblea la adhesión de nuevos Estados miembros. Pero ahí hay el aspecto esencial, imprescindible para nuestra organización colectiva. Como lo he mencionado en el pasado, como secretario general y como secretaría, en ese primer bienio de actividad ejecutiva, con acciones concretas para lograr las aspiraciones de nuestros pueblos, bueno, nuestro enfoque era consolidar la Secretaría, involucrar a los Estados miembros nuestros en esa construcción colectiva y, por supuesto, sin duda alguna, ejecutar, implementar el programa común de los Estados miembros para los 2 años pasados, 2023-2024. Asuntos que hemos logrado con éxito gracias al apoyo de los Estados miembros. Pero hoy sí entramos en esa nueva fase que es una fase también en paralelo de la continuación de la implementación del programa, de involucrar a más estados y con un particular enfoque. Y me permito decir un particular enfoque porque eso fue ratificado por los Estados miembros en la Asamblea, en particular con un enfoque en los estados, en regiones de nuestro Gran Sur, actualmente subrepresentadas en la membresía de la organización. De hecho, en particular estamos hablando de América Latina y el Caribe y del sureste asiático. Ahora, fíjese, estimadísimo José Luis, fíjese que no solo se determinó esto como un principio, sino que los estados aprobaron una propuesta para establecer oficinas regionales en esas regiones donde tenemos menos Estados miembros, para acercar la Secretaría a los estados en esas regiones, pero también, sobre todo, para tener más intercambios diarios, cotidianos, con los estados no miembros por ahora, y en la perspectiva de ver su adhesión. Así que se aprobó un presupuesto para lograr esa dinámica. Y eso será uno de los asuntos prioritarios. Pero también yo dije al principio, y tengo que ratificarlo ahora, esas sesiones serán sesiones, esas sesiones de la tercera vía en vivo con el secretario general, o serán sesiones transparentes, donde nos hablamos con toda la seriedad, pero también toda la honestidad necesaria para la construcción de un colectivo, o no vale la pena hacer esos episodios. Y entonces yo les voy a decir de forma muy concreta, no es tampoco que no habíamos intentado de sumar a más estados, aunque no era la prioridad número uno durante los 2 años que pasaron. Pero la realidad también, y eso se entiende perfectamente en términos de un Estado considerando una adhesión a un organismo multilateral e intergubernamental. Miren, ustedes acaban de empezar, ¿no?, su fase ejecutiva. Vamos a ver cómo sale todo. Y hoy por hoy, hemos demostrado nuestra capacidad colectiva de ejecución, de lograr una cooperación sur-sur eficaz, capaz, pero también se demostró la satisfacción de nuestros Estados miembros en esa dinámica. Porque no solamente es que aprobaron un nuevo plan de acción, programa común, que de hecho se publicará en línea, que es más amplio, que contiene más proyectos, pero sino que también aprobaron y nos establecieron un presupuesto para la organización que es más del doble del presupuesto que teníamos los 2 años pasados. Y eso también contribuye muchísimo a las decisiones de estados, porque siempre esos estados, los gobiernos de esos estados, tienen el deber de tomar decisiones tan importantes con la certeza que eso va a contribuir al beneficio de sus pueblos. Y entonces, hoy, también, como colectivo de naciones soberanas del sur, como familia del sur, incluyendo a gobiernos, organizaciones, pueblos e individuos, ya tenemos la base concreta y la evidencia empírica de que si estamos aquí es para seguir forjando el futuro y contribuir de forma tangible, concreta, a las aspiraciones de nuestro pueblo. Y los estados que han considerado adhesión, yo tengo confianza plena que en un futuro cercano se sumarán a esa familia de naciones a la cual ellos pertenecen plenamente, legítimamente. Y mientras tanto, seguimos colectivamente haciendo camino al andar. Si tiene otras preguntas, un desafío a hacerme, que no dude. I see a question from Catherine C. There is a fatalistic belief that the view that multiple countries being on an equal plane in terms of participation or subject of focus is not achievable. One country or region has to be dominant. There has to be, almost always, a leading group. What are your views on this? Is equality fundamentally a myth? What is the OSCE doing to ensure this? Thank you, Catherine. This is actually a very profound question. I do recall that in the very early days, when we had instilled this principle of equality amongst sovereign equals in our endeavors, that many were indeed skeptical. Equality alone, equality is not possible. There is always a dominant group, whether it is the economically more powerful or the quantitatively more powerful in terms of the number, etc. And I think well, several dimensions. Let me start by what I know with certainty now, because we've demonstrated it. We have seen it. It is not true that those that are quantitatively more, and therefore also, for the time being at the OSCE, economically more important in terms of the budget of the organization, so that they are necessarily taking dominance. The proof of this is that at this General Assembly, as you know, today, we have member states from Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, the Arab states, and Asia Pacific. But it is also true that quantitatively, we have more member states today from Africa. Which means also that Africa, the Africa group decision-making, voting power, so to speak, or voting share is bigger. And yet here's the very interesting thing, Catherine, that was seen at the General Assembly. The African group insisted that the next president of the General Assembly could not be African, because the first president of the General Assembly was African, demonstrating this understanding that this is an organization for all of us, by all of us. The second aspect that is quite interesting. Regarding the Greater South Fair for Endogenous Technology. The African group is again the majority group. Yet the Assembly, and especially the African group, encouraged the Assembly to take a decision regarding the next edition of GRESFET that would encourage countries in other regions of the South to host GRESFET for the next edition, because this edition is being held in Africa, demonstrating once more a determination to ensure that this is owned equally by all member states and by all regions. Similarly, again, interestingly, our member states, they're not obligated to do so, have decided that in their dynamics, rather than voting only and accepting what the rules say, which is a simple majority of votes, they want to proceed by consensus, which means giving up any advantage of voting shares that you may have to ensure that full ownership. So I think that in terms of practice, it has been demonstrated that our countries have understood the importance of that equality. In part, I think, because we are all too familiar with the Orwellian animal farm equality of other spaces, perhaps, where all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. And we do not want to replicate this in the OSCE, because when the OSCE was created, it was not just created as the first and only intergovernmental organization of the South. It was created with an understanding that we needed a new type of intergovernmental organization. And this is what our member states are forging. But then I would argue also that you look at, beyond just the principle of equality, you look at the structures of the OSCE, and they were designed to be democratic. We don't have an executive board where there's fewer countries that can take decisions for everybody else. We don't have a council that can do that. At the Assembly, every country can vote. Then, of course, some countries can decide not to vote, abstain, not attend, but the right is there, across the board. But then I would also argue that equality is impotent, and perhaps not even desirable when taken alone. it must be accompanied by other dynamics. And that is why we also have equity as a fundamental problem, a fundamental principle to address the problem of equality taken alone. Equity, where we say, yes, we are all equal, one country, one vote. But some countries have more needs than others, some have more capacity than others. And therefore, to accompany equality, because when you treat equally, let's put it at the level of individuals. Individuals who have started at very different points in their lives, you treat them equally, you are just reproducing inequality. That is, you treat the son of the millionaire exactly the same as you treat the daughter of the working class parents that are from, on top of it, an ethnic or religious or linguistic minority that has been historically marginalized. You treat them equally, you are reproducing inequality. And therefore equity on top of equality. That is, in the case of the OSCE, from each member state according to their ability, and to each member state according to their need. But even then, equality alone is impotent. It needs equity. But equality and equity alone themselves run the risk of falling into a dangerous dynamic, unintended consequences. That is where there is the burden all on the shoulders of some as well, in the case of countries. Especially in the case of our countries, there are all countries in development, developing countries. There would be a different case if we were not the Organization of Southern Cooperation. And that is why you also need the principle of solidarity, in which you understand that we share above all a community of destiny, in that we need to also help each other out by sharing the meal, not just sharing the leftovers, and that this together ensures, I think, that the OSCE as a collective of countries does not fall in a dynamic of excessive, I shall say, dominance of any particular country or any particular region. And to this day, this has been demonstrated without any equivocation. I hope I have answered your question. Feel free to challenge or ask a clarification. Well, it is a comment, but I will read it out, and I'll read it out because we're also leaving soon, because I'm told we are running out of time due to other engagements. But excelente idea, says José Luis Salmón Soriano, excelente idea sobre la aproximación de la OCS hacia otras regiones del planeta. Sin dudas, hay que primero construir los cimientos para luego continuar adelante con el programa. Muchas gracias, José Luis Salmón. Y I see just a greeting from María Clara Sharupi that says, saludos desde Ecuador, greetings from Ecuador. Of course, then, in her native tongue, she makes an additional comment that I cannot read. But I wanted for all of you to see this, because María Clara Sharupi is an extraordinary individual. She came here in Addis Ababa, knowing no one here, not knowing us as an organization per se, traveling all the way from Ecuador, from her community, because she is from an indigenous community, of Ecuador to come and share her poetry during the Festival of the Greater Self, with a profound human dimension that was expressed despite the fact that most of us could not understand her native language, her mother tongue. But you could feel it resonating. A woman of extraordinary commitment. And she did gift me, I wish, if I knew she was going to join us, I would have brought the book of poetry, because there are some of the poems that are extraordinary. But in any event, I highly recommend everyone to read her poetry, which is also available in Spanish. I do not know about other languages. But mis saludos, María Clara, mis saludos y un abrazo a usted. Y esperemos verla de nuevo muy pronto, aquí, en Addis Abeba y en sus tierras. Así que bueno, I think we have to conclude this session according to the boss, that is Pearl Humura. And Pearl is the extraordinary lady that is the driving force. I am sorry to say that to the rest of you, but the driving force of the public advocacy, communication, engagement team, the PACE team of the OSC, and also the one that keeps me on my toes with regards to time when it comes to those sessions. But this said, I would like to conclude by thanking all of you for having participated to this session, for having articulated your views, your questions, your preoccupations as well. And to tell you that here from the OSCE, here from this headquarters, here as a collective of sovereign states, of the family of the South, here as a collective of civil society organizations, academic bodies, determined to make a difference, here as a collective of individuals who each, from their own place, their own vantage point, contribute to our common aspirations here. Ours is the endeavor as we collectively build this third way of development from and by the South for humanity. As we now have a renewed mandate, both personally, but crucially, as an institution, to deliver on a broader, more expanded, more profound, more ambitious common program. Here, ours, as I repeatedly do now, is a tradition. Ours is the constant reminder of Mario Benedetti's words. Que hay quienes se desmueren y hay quienes se desviven, y así entre todos logran lo que era un imposible. Que todo el mundo sepa que el sur también existe. And there are those who die, those who live, doing their utmost in the endeavor. And between them, between all of them, they achieve what was once thought to be impossible. That the entirety of the world may know that the South also exists.